Okay. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Maki Hayashikawa, Director of the Division for Education 2030 in UNESCO. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the International Symposium, Ensuring the Right to Quality Inclusive Education for Persons with Disabilities, co-organized by UNESCO, the Ministry of Education Portugal, and Leonard Tesher. This symposium is organized on the occasion of the International Day of Persons with Disabilities and will run over 3 days. Each day will address a specific theme. Let me recall them briefly. Today, after the opening ceremony, from 3 to 5 p.m. Paris time will be session 1, which will discuss policy frameworks, funding and monitoring arrangement for inclusive education for learners with disabilities. Tomorrow, Thursday, the 26th November, we will have 2 sessions. Session 2 from 11 a.m. to 12:20 Paris time on teaching and learning processes to ensure access and participation of learners with disabilities, and Session 3 from 3 to 5 p.m. in the afternoon on inclusive and safe learning environments, including by addressing violence and bullying against learners with disabilities. And finally, on Friday, 27th of November, in the afternoon from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Paris time, we will discuss in the concluding session the lessons learned from COVID-19 and the need to rebuild stronger inclusive education systems. Our session today will start with opening remarks from Ms. Stefania Giannini, Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO, and His Excellency Mr. Tiago Brandão Rodrigues, Minister of Education of Portugal. Before I give the floor to our distinguished speakers for the welcoming remarks, let me inform all our participants and audience that interpretation is available in English, French, and Spanish, as well as in International Sign, and that the symposium is recorded for wider sharing later on. I would also like to remind the speakers and panelists to kindly switch off their microphones and videos when they are not speaking. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Stefania Giannini to deliver her welcoming remarks. Ms. Stefania Giannini is our Assistant Director General for Education. As a former Minister of Education herself of Italy, she developed and implemented a structural reform of the Italian education system centered around social inclusion and cultural awareness. So please, ADG, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maki. Good morning, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Your Excellency, Mr. Tiago Brandão Rodrigues, Minister of Education of Portugal, and dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to open this important meeting. And let me start really and deeply by thanking the co-organizers of this 3-day symposium, which Maki already very well described in terms of the Rano show, the Ministry of Education of Portugal under the leadership of His Excellency Mr. Brandão Rodrigues and Leonard Tesher. Well, it's a great pleasure for UNESCO to be part, an active part of this important discussion in the opening session. And let me say that everything starts somehow with a very simple phrase, leaving no one behind. Around this very simple message, the entire world launched the most ambitious action plan, which has never been presented to political leaderships and at the highest level and the communities everywhere in 2015, which is the 2030 Agenda, the Transformative Development Agenda for a better and a more sustainable world. And within this agenda, SDG 4, as we say in our community, the Sustainable Development Goal, which is about quality, inclusive education for all, and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all, is very much the cutting cross point. This is at the core of our symposium today, and this is our shared common responsibility and our goal, really. Since the beginning of this year, the world is facing an unprecedented economic and social disruption caused by a big game changer, the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we know, all of us, education has not been spared. We know that children and youth with disabilities are amongst the most vulnerable to exclusion from education or marginalized within systems. UNESCO's 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report this year, not by chance, is about inclusion. My colleague Manos will give to you his perspective and presentation later on. This year, the title was a very impressive one, in my opinion. All means all. And they say that they estimate that 40% of the poorest countries failed to support learners at risk during the COVID-19 crisis. And this crisis has shown us the need for an education system based on the fundamental principles we are promoting within the agenda, 2030 agenda: inclusion, equity, and non-discrimination. Education systems were already facing new challenges in treating all individuals, all learners fairly and equally, and in promoting gender equality as well. And these challenges have been amplified, exacerbated by the crisis more than ever. They were discussed at the extraordinary session of the Global Education Meeting 2020 that UNESCO convened last month, together with the governments of Ghana, UK, Norway. Let me say how honored we were to have an intervention from President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, one of the most inspiring, really, as usual. And I remember that in that speech, President Rebelo de Sousa really emphasized the importance of keeping inclusion as a key word of the action plan that ministers and the heads of states and governments agreed with in the meeting. They endorse a declaration. It's a short document which now can give us the roadmap in the coming 12, 15 months. And it's about expressing a strong commitment to protect education financing and outlining priority measures, priority policies to safeguard education from this existing and devastating impact of the pandemic. I will mention briefly, but I'm sure in this virtual room, all of you have in mind this kind of common action plan. First, taking every measure we can to reopen schools safely and inclusively. Second, supporting all teachers as frontline workers. We said many times, we know rhetorics really, our heroes in the classroom, as well a bit like medical doctors in the hospital. Third, investing in skills development from the social-emotional dimension to gaining competencies for new jobs, including, crucially, digital competencies, of course. And fourth, last but really not least, especially now, narrowing the digital divide that has shut out education for 1/3 of the world's students. Well, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the return to school provides a unique opportunity, a tremendous opportunity for all of us to ensure that all children, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized and learners with disabilities, are included within all school reopening plans. Everyone benefits when schools are free from discriminations. Learners, teachers, parents, and communities. I come from a country, Italy, which pioneered about the issue of learners and children with disability in schools. thanks to a law which has been approved in the latest 70s. So I really have a very clear in my mind the importance of this topic and developing policies around this topic. Last year, we celebrated in Cali, Colombia, in collaboration with the Ministry of Education of that country, the 25th anniversary of the World Conference on Special Needs Education, held that time in Salamanca, Spain. The Cali Forum called for stepped up action on inclusion and stressed the urgency to build education systems that make diversity a strength. It's possible to do, we have to do like this. Every learner matters equally. This is what inclusion is about. This is really that putting at the center of the process of learning and teaching persons, human beings, and especially persons who have more difficulties to run the process of learning in the business as usual model. This is not an easy task, we know, because inclusion calls for change. Inclusion calls for transformation, calls for a paradigm shift, which is not simply about implementing policies, which is an important pillar of the action plan, but it is very much about changing the mindset behind. To end, I would like to put forward a few essential drivers of inclusion. First, governments must ensure that appropriate legislative frameworks are in place to enshrine the right to education and fight all forms of discrimination. Second, countries require a precise understanding of who is excluded, why and when, and calling for more disaggregated data from a diversity of sources. Data first and better data to inform better policies. Last but really not least, we need to build education systems to make diversity a strength and where every learner matters equally. Teachers and school leaders must be at the heart of the process, as I said before. UNESCO, of course, is the house of human rights and is the house of improving in the quality of education in a perspective of giving right to education to all learners in the world. We are working on all these fronts. We are trying to reinforce and strengthen national capacities and legal policy frameworks and strengthening partnerships around this topic. Our 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion provides very important recommendations on how to include all learners, no matter their identity, background, or ability to learn. Building inclusive and equitable systems of education requires, of course, broad social engagement, sustained political commitment, and financing. UNESCO stands with you, making in this topic a top political and policy priority through the recovery funds and stimulus packages and going beyond in the coming years. I thank you very much for your attention and I wish you a very successful symposium. I will take the floor once again, moderating a panel as Maki already mentioned. Thank you very much. Maki, over to you.
Thank you very much, ADG. Now I have the pleasure to recognize the presence of His Excellency Mr. Tiago Brandão Rodrigues, Honorable Minister of Education of Portugal. Under his leadership, Portugal has built a new inclusive education law in 2018, which provides some of Europe's most innovative and genuinely inclusive resources for the future. Your Excellency, may I invite you to take the floor, please.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to Portugal to host this meeting. And I would like to start by thanking UNESCO and especially you, Stefania Giannini, for giving us the opportunity to host this meeting, this virtual meeting. It's a pity that we are not together here in Lisbon. Today, not a sunny city, but as you know, a lovely city that it's always ready to receive all of you. And I would like to start by thanking you, Stefania, and the entire UNESCO representatives for being our home and being our home to discuss these particular issues that are so important to our educational community. Of course, I also want to thank and salute the members of Leonard Cheshire Association, our kind co-hosts of this such important symposium. Special word for the ambassadors of UNESCO, and I would like to thank Professor Sampaio da Nova, the best Portuguese voice that we can have in UNESCO, and of course a special word for all the moderators, all the speakers, in special fellow ministers and governmental representatives. Of course, my Secretary of State, João Costa, that is one of the main voices in the world when we speak about inclusion. And I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the ones that are following us. Portugal, as we know, has been working mainly during the last 5 years to achieve a very significant and important mantra in our educational system: success for all with equity among all. This mantra, I would say this obligation, has not changed with the pandemic, with or without the confinement of the educational community. The pandemic only increased our duty to pursue it. The pandemic, as we know, is indeed an additional reason for all of us to say yes to this opportunity of co-organizing a discussion about inclusion of all, starting on those who have disabilities, and in educational system aimed to address each one and every one of our students. Our main challenge, as I believe, is the challenge of all countries, our main challenge, and as I believe is the challenge of the entire world, is to not let this pandemic to deviate our course. Our course in promoting the school success, on assuring school equity, and of course on granting effective inclusion. This is the path we have been undertaking since 1991, the path that brought us to the inclusion of more than 97% of our children and youngsters with disabilities on the so-called mainstream education. This was a path where, of course, politicians played a role, but only the role of pointing the direction and to pursue it. The role to effectively achieve it, the main role has been and will always be the role of teachers and educators, and the role of those who structure and implementing the training on inclusion. Portugal has had the chance of benefiting as well as promoting a broader national discussion about inclusion and inclusive education, always framing this discussion on the human rights and the children's rights scopes. We include children with disabilities in the common school voice on the general school environment, but we never forget to give them also the platform to project their own voice on their specific matters. That's why even in one of our flagship events called the Student Voice, a participatory process developed each year and all year long in the great majority of our schools, we integrate the voice of those that normally feel excluded in order to reinforce the acknowledgement of the entire educational community that there are still their peers that do not see themselves as fully integrated, reinforcing the urgency of a common action of all to correct the remaining exclusion and integrate and include the still excluded. We know well that providing equal opportunities and social inclusion has been one of the main challenges all over the world when assessing educational responses to this health crisis. This crisis showed us very well, how flexible and resilient and resistant we need to be. Our concerns within inclusive education go beyond the classroom and focus also other learning environments, since the provision of new experiences for all as full citizens is crucial. That's the reason why we also have in our schools sports policies, and in my portfolio I also have youth and sports, and these school sports policies have been crucial to improve a quality education and create conditions for disabled students to be part of a fairer and more balanced society. At this particular moment, we have around 7,000 students practicing 20 different inclusive sports for students with and without any kind of disability. This is a huge step towards solidarity, inclusion, citizenship education among students, since everyone can play and interact with each other. During these pandemic times, we also had the greatest concerns with children and youngsters with disabilities. And this is visible in the investment we have made so that they continue to have physical activity. Even at home, through the hashtag Be Active at Home campaign, videos and guidelines for children, youngsters, and adults with any kind of disabilities were made available. Our challenge as governments is not only to think about how we cannot leave anyone behind, but also how we can prevent learners from leaving education and schools. This has been the challenge in building trust, transparency, understanding, and quality. Because our action in each of our countries is aimed at everyone without considering age, social class, gender, or ethnicity, or even skills. Here and now, Portugal would like to reiterate its commitment in improving and equipping ourselves with additional skills, with additional knowledge, with additional qualifications, with more recognition, so with more power. This pandemic represents for us an unprecedented challenge. Therefore, more than ever before, we need to work hand by hand globally in creating innovative policies, even with social distancing. That is exactly the invitation that we have to all the countries to work together hand by hand once again to try to reach a more inclusive education and a global inclusive education. Thank you so much, UNESCO. Thank you so much, Stefania. And I would like to finish thanking moderators, speakers, and of course, participants. Have a good conference. And I hope that together we can have a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for sharing your strong commitment to and being a strong advocate for the cause of genuine inclusion of all in education. Now, I would like to transition to our first set of presentations to set the scene for the sessions to follow today and over the entire 3 days of the symposium. I'm very pleased to invite my colleague, Mr. Manos Antonines, the Director of the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report, to give an overall presentation of the 2020 edition of the GEM report, which is on inclusion in education. So Manos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maki, and hello to everybody. While I upload and share my screen with you for my presentation, I would like to say, perhaps off script, a couple of thoughts and share with you an appreciation for all co-organizers. And I would start, of course, with UNESCO, whose stance over inclusion over a very long period of time, I would say, is probably the crown in the jewel of its education achievements. Leonard Cheshire, how much we wish all charities remained as focused in their objectives as you have, and we're very lucky to have benefited from your advice and support over the years. But a last and maybe a bit more extensive word on Portugal, which indeed has taken over the flag of inclusion in education from Italy when Italy started in the 70s. I just want to share a small story. I actually was lucky enough about a couple of years ago to be in Lisbon on a day like this, and I had the chance of meeting with State Secretary Costa, asking him at a very, very short and late notice if he could join and represent Portugal in the launch of our previous Global Education Monitoring Report on migration and displacement. And the Portuguese government was very generous in granting him that opportunity, and he joined us in Berlin. And he gave a speech, and I have to say I had no idea. We were just starting our work on inclusion. I had no idea the progress that Portugal had made and how much of a symbol it was for the rest of the world. And he gave us a speech that was really extremely motivated, and I am acknowledging it just to say how it influenced also the way we approached the theme of inclusion in our Global Education Monitoring Report for 2020. So to start with that, the theme of inclusion and the way we approached it was very much influenced by this idea. We know that all countries in 2015 signed up to inclusive education as a fundamental component of SDG 4. However, it's also fair to say that for many countries around the world, it is not entirely clear what they had signed up to. And that became for us the objective and the main aim of this report, to put together and summarize all the efforts that have gone to promote the case for inclusion. So we refer to inclusion as a process. First and foremost, one process that celebrates diversity and helps build a sense of belonging in order to achieve social cohesion. And in this process, all actions should be rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential. Nobody should be discriminated, nobody should be rejected. Education systems should adjust to learners' needs and not the other way around. Of course, a case for inclusion has been made by the community of persons in support of the rights of persons with disabilities, who helped ensure in 2006 that the right to inclusive education was enshrined in international law. But it took another 10 years, and it is to the credit of this community, which was expressed in the General Common 4 of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, issued as recently as 2016, which argued that essentially inclusion is not just about one group, because the mindset and the mechanisms that generate discrimination and rejection are the same for all those excluded. Every society needs to own up to the mechanisms that are there that exclude. And as you heard, identity, background, and ability still dictate education opportunities. I'm not going to take you through all these statistics, but you'll see the breadth of this report. I will focus on this last finding at the very bottom. You see, we know actually that even today, as many as 12 million children around the world don't even ever go to school, the most shocking form of exclusion. And among them, children with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely to never to go to school than their peers, suffering the worst exclusion amongst the worst excluded. The report has 10 recommendations. The first and foremost is the one that I mentioned before. It is extremely important for governments around the world to widen the understanding of inclusion. A review that we have done of definitions of inclusion around the world showed that only 1 in 3 have such a definition that covers multiple groups. The second recommendation refers to financing. And of course, it's very important to target financing to those left behind. But it is important to base the financing on the support that we provide to learners who need them, and not on labels. And Portugal, and I hope this will be shared with you throughout these 3 days of the conference, offers an excellent example of how to do that many countries could benefit from. The third and related one is that we have a legacy of segregation and exclusion, and specialist resources have unfortunately been concentrated in few areas of the education system. To achieve inclusion, we need to share this expertise and resources. Inclusion, at the end of the day, ends up often being an issue of managing our resources better. The fourth and the fifth refer to the need for collaboration. In many communities, parents themselves are not in favor of inclusion. They seek comfort in segregating themselves or asking for others to be educated separately. So it's very important to listen to their voices and see how we can win them over. And that involves consultations. Inclusion can only be achieved in a bottom-up way. And sometimes it's difficult, even if we set the example right, to achieve things just from top down. And the governments need to show this openness for collaboration. It is extremely important for education ministries to work consistently and coherently with ministries of health, of social protection, of other ministries and departments that work for vulnerable groups. It's only through sharing information and designing programs coherently that we can achieve the efficiency we need. And collaboration also extends beyond governments to non-government actors. We know that civil society and organizations of people with disabilities have been the most powerful advocates of inclusion, watchdogs that help keep governments at their feet, ensuring that they fulfill their commitments. They also provide services, sometimes on contract, sometimes on their own initiative, reaching children that governments sometimes do not reach. It is very important to ensure that what they do is in line with a national policy that is rooted in inclusion. Universal design is, of course, a core concept that we have heard over the years about how to ensure that anything from objects to systems fits the needs of all people at the same time. It has referred, in the case of education, to infrastructure. It has referred to learning environments. In the report, we interpret it even more broadly to cover curriculum. A lot of curricula and teaching and learning materials actually discriminate and exclude with omission and misrepresentation. And that also refers to assessment mechanisms that sometimes seem to be there to punish students rather than to give them an opportunity to show how they learn what they have learned. And for that, all teachers should be prepared to teach all students. Inclusion should not be a specialist topic. And that's very important for both pre-service and in-service training programs. And school leaders as well, who sometimes are not supported sufficiently to manage this complex change, need to be also trained to instill an inclusive ethos. Data should be collected with attention and respect. There's been a lot of progress, especially in the case of collecting data on students with disabilities through the Washington Group's questions and the module on children. But it's important to go also beyond that opportunity to disaggregate data, to also collect information that is very important for ministries to be aware, whether children, students feel cared for, whether they belong to school. And finally, celebrate what we're doing today and what we will be doing over the next 3 days. Learn from peers. It is very important because inclusion is, as I said, first and foremost a process, and different societies can reach the objectives that they define in many different ways. So it's important to look around and see what others have done and do that better. This was also our contribution to this debate. In addition to the report, we also launched in June a new website that documents how countries, 160 countries, all those countries outside Europe that has its own resources already, approach inclusion in education through their laws and policies. We want it to be a basis for peer dialogue, a base on which we will be adding other layers, including the latest information on how countries approach equity through their financing policies. A short note, just not to forget that, of course, COVID-19 has been a major blow in many ways, but also a blow that made us realize how important it is to apply the principle of doing no harm. We have followed and focused on many solutions of distance learning that at the end of the day is an imperfect substitute to being in the classroom under the circumstances, but also solutions that sometimes increase further the gap between those who benefit from certain advantages and those who are disadvantaged. So it's very important in this period to consider also social, emotional, and mental health needs, not just the academic ones, to tackle the less straightforward subjects, those that require physical contact, especially for younger children, and also to reconsider, take the opportunity to reconsider some of our practices. Assessment is one of those. I conclude, and I will invite my colleagues in UNESCO to play a short animation that summarizes these messages, just to say that the report has also already issued a regional edition on Latin America and the Caribbean earlier this month, and we will be launching the final regional edition of the report in February on Central and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I wish you success in the next 3 days.
Thank you very much, Manos. Now, before we move on to the high-level panel, we have, for the next presentation, we have the pleasure to listen to Mr. Eddie Ndopu, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Advocate. We're very happy to have Eddie together with us. Eddie is from South Africa. He's an activist, humanitarian, and a public intellectual. He's one of the advocates of
Everyone is different.
So
The
Eddie,
2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion and Education believes that education is strongest when it embraces diversity. Learners should not have to adapt to the system. Instead, education systems should adapt to their needs. When students do not feel welcome in school, they are less likely to learn. This is everyone's loss. But rich and poor countries too often educate some children apart. Children who have a disability, have been displaced, speak a different language, or are poor and disadvantaged. School design may favor some students over others, as do many laws and policies. Teachers are often ill-equipped to cater for students' diverse needs. Children may not recognize the way they are portrayed in textbooks. Some may not see themselves there at all. They receive the message that they do not belong. Testing sometimes follows a narrow vision of education, and consequently, some students leave education earlier than they should. These are complex problems to solve, but a belief in the right to education is a belief in inclusion. Children have different learning speeds and needs. They need curricula that are flexible, creative, and relevant. How we prepare teachers matters. They must be given the tools and training to achieve our vision for reform. The resources we know can help the marginalized, educators, support staff, and equipment should be shared so that everyone can benefit. Better data on those left behind will help us reach them. Disadvantages often accumulate. We can't address inclusion one group at a time. Redressing these disadvantages requires funds. These must be equitable and target individual-specific needs. We must work together on these tasks across government ministries, from central to local authorities, with civil society supporting governments, and schools opening doors to the community. Inclusion in education requires a change in mindset in society, so that education for all means education for everyone, without exception. Achieving this is everybody's business, including yours.
Hello, everybody. I am really thrilled and delighted to be joining you today. And I just want to start by extending my heartfelt gratitude and appreciation to UNESCO and all of its partners for this convening. I speak to you today as one of 17 Sustainable Development Goals advocates appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, but I also speak to you today as a young person with a disability, somebody who is really a living embodiment of what is possible when we invest in inclusive education. I was diagnosed at the age of 2 with a rare degenerative condition called spinal muscular atrophy, and I was given a prognosis of 5. And I'll be turning 30 literally in a few days. So I have outlived myself by 25 years. And over and above that, I could have easily become a statistic. Growing up as a young person with a disability living in South Africa, I was deeply cognizant of the really terrible statistics around the educational plight of children with disabilities. I grew up knowing and understanding deeply that between 90 and 98% of children with disabilities at that stage never saw the inside of a classroom. I'd like to fast forward from that date to the year 2016, when I became the first African with a degenerative disability to be admitted to the University of Oxford at the Blavatsky School of Government. I hold a master's degree in public policy. And really my advocacy has been about the fact that there is no contradiction between being somebody who has a disability and being an economically productive citizen of society. And so when we talk about inclusive education, it is really important that we underscore the fact that this is not an abstract public policy enterprise. This really is about facilitating the self-actualization of people with disabilities so that we can tap into the unharnessed potential of this enormous segment of society. We are ready, willing, and able to contribute not just to our societies, but really usher humanity into a new way of thinking about the value of human beings and what is possible. And so I'm really delighted. I am the only person with a physical disability within the group of the Secretary General's SDG advocates, and I am determined to join this journey with all of you and with UNESCO to ensure that we don't leave anybody behind. But we need to do so not because it's just the right thing to do, but we need to do so in recognition of the fact that this is the smart thing to do for all of our economies, that leaving nobody behind doesn't just mean reaching out to those that are furthest behind the line of opportunity, but really opening up space for our voices to be amplified at the forefront of the global agenda. So it's about leadership. And my vision is that we'll have more children with disabilities across the world, not just having access to basic education, but going all the way to places like Oxford University and actually having a seat at the table so that we are in the driver's seat of international development. So I think that that's really the message, that those furthest behind the line of opportunity should not be left out as line items in development spending and development assistance, because we recognize that when we harness the potential of all people, regardless of who they are or where they come from, that they are able to lead and really shape the trajectory of humanity. And so with that, I'd like to thank UNESCO, and I wish you all well in your deliberations over the next few days, and let us ensure that all hands are on deck so that nobody's left behind. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Apologies a while ago for the bit of a technical glitch. And thank you very much once again, Eddie. It was very inspiring to hear your vision, experience, and determination as an advocate for SDG, but also as a global role model of inclusion. Now we will be turning to the high-level panel discussion. We're very honored to welcome today 4 distinguished panelists: Mr. Juan Costa from Portugal, Mr. Tibebu from Ethiopia, Ms. Kumbo Bolibari, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, and Mr. Jaya Prasad Acharya from Nepal. The speakers will share their views and perspectives on what policies and strategies are needed to accelerate efforts towards ensuring inclusive education for learners with disabilities. This high-level panel will be moderated by my ADG, Ms. Giannini, so it is my pleasure to welcome her back again and hand over the floor. ADG, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maki. Thank you. If I may, I join you thanking Eddie for this very important, touching message, which, to summarize, explains to us what not to be included in a regular classroom means. And I think it's important to start to reflect with our outstanding panelists. I thank warmly all of them to be here with us today about this point. We know that the inclusive dimension of the right to education are definitely based on a few principles which are important in terms of legal frameworks and providing solutions on the ground. And the effective implementation of the right to education definitely requires governments to take their own responsibility and to put in practice these principles that I'm sure all of us agree with, and that's the core topic of this important conference as well. So Maki has already introduced our distinguished panelists. Just let me recall the four of them: Mr. Tibebu Bogale Dershe, who is Chief Advisor for Inclusive Education to the Minister of Education of Ethiopia; Ms. Kumbubo Libari, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education; Mr. João Costa, State Secretary of Education of Portugal and linguist, a colleague, if I can say, welcome all of you; and Mr. Yaya Prasad Acharya, Undersecretary of the Ministry of Education and Training in Nepal. The idea is to listen to all of you, to let you share your perspectives on what policies and strategies are needed concretely to ensure that learners with disabilities have equitable access to quality learning in inclusive settings, including during this unprecedented situation and time of COVID-19. And before we close the panel, I kindly ask you to refer to the audience and to share with us a few priority actions or recommendations. I'm sure it will be very useful as a legacy of this conference for all of us. Well, let me start briefly to open our discussion with Mr. Tibelu from the Ministry of Education of Ethiopia. Let me also recall that Ethiopia is a country which is very much engaged in this topic of inclusion for students and children with disabilities. Your role is to coordinate the establishment of inclusive education resources centers throughout the country. Ethiopia, on the other side, is a country very much close to UNESCO in terms of providing the Futures of Education initiative of UNESCO a strong and really important leadership from the head of state, Ms. Sahle-Work, the president of Ethiopia, who is very much engaged, chairing the International Commission. And thanks once again to her for a strong commitment on this topic. Well, you have more or less 7 minutes to respond to some questions. I put some food for thought on the table, and I would like to ask you to tell us about the Ethiopian experience regarding access to education of learners and children with disabilities. What did you achieve in the last few years, and how the inclusive education resource centers that the country has established help to promote inclusion? And the last question, of course, how the situation is going within this COVID-19 pandemic environment. Thanks. Over to you. I hope.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't see you. I don't know if other colleagues can help you to turn on the video camera.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
You can see me, but
yes.
I'm going to turn to my slides to present. I'm not going to dwell on theoretical conceptions of inclusive education, but rather describe like anecdotal description of what we have been doing, our experiences. From the beginning, we started with certain principles Ethiopia is poor, and people think that, well, how can a poor country provide inclusive education? But we started from at least three principles that uh, are part of the global beliefs, like all children have the right to education. So when we say all, it means all children, not excluding this or that. This is one. And the other one is resources or lack of resources should not be the reason for discrimination. This is the other principle. People cannot hide behind lack of resources for not providing education. And the third one is that schools must change. We shouldn't wait until children are prepared or like that. But schools must change to meet the needs of children with special needs. These are the three things we uh, that guided us. So based on those, that uh, the enrollment rate in Ethiopia has been 3%, 4% before we started this, and the plan is to reach 75% in 5 years. Well, that is ambitious, but that was planned. So what we did first was to do a baseline, to explore what the attitudes of practitioners, community, and uh, professionals are. And the second one was what is the practice, what is existing. This was the second assessment. And then the third one we did was what policy provisions are there, what policy are there. And so these were the three things we explored. And when it comes to the attitudes, I mean, it is like in any other country, we have these fears of parents or resignation and like that. But what we understood that was that parents were realistic in that they said that, well, it doesn't have, we don't have to spend much time on uh, thinking about the causes, but think about what we can do now. So this was the understanding we had. So we worked with parents and others, what we can do with the existing resources we have. And when we explore the policy, the government has a policy for inclusive education, and it has developed a strategy and also a 10-year plan. Uh, and the third one is on practice. We have few special schools, and those are based on the charity model, and they were given by, missionaries and like that. So it was just the resources were coming from outside. So there was no participation on the part of the community. So these were the uh, the conditions when we started. So we thought of working at three levels because the attitude, knowledge, and the practice, uh, among professionals, the community, and teachers, and all this was not that encouraging. So we thought of working at, with professionals, with teachers, and with the communities. So this work was, directed in, was planned in three areas. One was to strengthen the support system in the inclusive education resource centers. For those of you who don't know the resource centers, they are sometimes called cluster schools in other countries, where these are like stronger schools, and we have satellite schools around them. So in Ethiopia, you have 5 to 6 satellite schools for each resource center. So strengthening these resource centers was the first work we embarked on. And the plan is to reach 800 resource centers in 4 years. And when we say 800 resource centers, it means we are reaching satellite schools as well. So if you multiply 800 by 5, then it will be like 4,000 schools that will be reached by the end of 4 years. But this is not, when you compare it to the number of schools in the country, which is currently at 40,000, so it is only 10% of the schools that we're reaching. But this is the plan. Then reach also as many children as possible at the end of the 4 years, which is like the plan was to reach 24,000 students in these schools. And then the other thing was equipping the resource centers, strengthening them, providing them some materials and like the braille, stylus, hearing aids, etc. And then teachers training of communities. This was the one direction we were working on, strengthening the schools, the school, the teacher, and the surrounding. This was the first working area we planned. And the second working area we planned was building the capacity of experts at different levels. Not only, at a very lower level, but even from, we have the provinces, we call them zones and regions, and even at the mediancy of the education level. So this was the second area where we thought we'll focus, because the attitude, as I said, the knowledge of expertise is not different from the community. So we have to work with experts as well, and including the colleges of teacher training. We have colleges of teacher training which train teachers for basic education, basic schools. So we thought of working with them so that the newly graduating teachers also know about inclusive education. So this was the second one, producing materials like guidelines, tools, etc., and training the local people, the local experts, and other experts in the sector, in the other sectors as well, the health and etc. So this is the second phase. And the third one, the second category, and the third one was to organize, a system for good data. As it is now, the data system is not good and the data is not reliable. So we also thought of working in the direction of improving the data collection system, the analysis of the data, and the reporting. The purpose of this was so that we can see our progress, and then this data will help us for planning in the future for like the next 5 years, and for policy formulation and management of inclusive education. So in this area also we are working with the data collection team. There are people who are working in the educational information and management system. So we work with them. And the other one was we're working also with the schools. I mean, the schools should have a system of collecting data and then reporting and also analyzing at school level, so that the policy formulation will be better. So we're working in the improving the data collection system, the analysis system from school level to local authority levels, regional level, and the federal level. And I have to say this is the area which has been very difficult for us so far.
Thank you very much. You still have some points?
No, that should be. Yeah. I think if you are giving me another 1 minute, then next time I'll conclude.
Okay.
But
really 1 minute, because you have another turn, right? Really quick turn at the end. So I think you can also take this opportunity. But please go to an end.
Yeah. Well, what we have learned from this is that when people know what they are doing, you get a very good result. So the training has been very, very effective in that teachers, communities, and everyone knows what is the goal of the work is. So the training capacity building is very, very important. The second one is that involving local government and communities is also very, very important. And when they know, the local governments can allocate budget, the communities can allocate budget, they also manage the program and supervise it and etc. So far about 250 additional resource centers were established by the region and the local government. So you can see we're planning to, we have currently about 400 in this by the government, but the community has 250. So it's like a matching. So that's very good. Then we thought diversifying the sources of resources is very important. So the schools are encouraged to raise their own resources from the local, the CBOs, NGOs, from the community. And this has been very, very satisfying in that all of these schools we are currently supporting have raised funds locally. So it's not that much, but I mean, it's very encouraging. And we have also seen that transparency, accountability, and participation has been higher in that whatever resources they raise, whatever resources they get from the government, these resources are used in a transparent manner, and the people are accountable, and teachers, community leaders, all take part in these decision makings. And we have found out that the parents' participation has been very encouraging, and that when they are involved, they are encouraged, they are motivated to raise more funds and make the school program very sustainable. But then the challenge has been when we say like the number of children with disabilities has increased, but still the gender parity is not that good. More boys are now in school than girls, so we have to work in that area. And then the other challenge has been the preschool, pre-primary. When children start from early age, the results are good, but participation of children with disabilities in the pre-primary is very low, and we're just starting, but we found that that's very important, but that's an area where we have to work more. And then the other thing is we have to work more with college of teacher education, because we can't train the currently existing teachers, but if the newly graduating teachers are not trained, that will be a gap. So it's working with college of teacher college is very important, and that we have started and we are seeing the fruits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tibelo. Really very interesting sharing your experience from the importance of data, of involvement of the entire education community, and the political ambition to move to 3 to 5%. I think it's what we need. Thank you very much. J'ai le plaisir maintenant.
Now I should like to hand over to Madame Kombu Mbuli Mbari. Are you connected? Can you hear me? So I hope that you can hear me. Madame Kombu Mbuli is the special rapporteur on the right to education and has been since 2016, but she is also a former Minister of Education and Literacy of Burkina Faso. And given your mission, I'm sure that you would be well placed to describe to us the challenges that governments are facing when it comes to ensuring that the principle of the right to education is to become a concrete policy. So what we're hoping to do is look together as to what states can do, given that they have this obligation to protect or nurture and respect the right to education. We also know that disabled students are facing added barriers and obstacles. We know that young children and youth who have disabilities are sometimes shunned from the education systems around the world. And so the question that I want to ask you is, what are the tools or levers that states may use if they want to ensure their inclusion into the education system and therefore respect the right to education, and particularly in a situation of crisis like now? I can give you 5 minutes for this first question, madam. Thank you very much, Ms. Giannini. Thank you very much for having invited me to take part in this very important process of dialogue. We want to thank you for your commitment, and thank UNESCO and the other co-facilitators for everything they're doing for an inclusive education. As we know, UNESCO is working very hard in this regard, and at the time as we are talking, much is being done, and it's time to encourage that continued work. So thank you. When we look at the overall situation, what we can see is that the convention exists, and states have ratified that convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. And so it's important that those rights be respected at the national level. So the legal framework does exist. And as concerns international right, like the Universal Covenant on Rights, the International Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we've also got the rights of the child. There's a whole barrage of different international instruments to ensure that discrimination against children, against women be outlawed, and yet many countries have already integrated into their national legislation the principles of these international declarations and instruments and declarations and conventions under the UN system. But where we really have difficulties is actually the implementation, how states can actually manage to plan for this. And this is particularly true for children. And I think UNESCO's monitoring report, and I'd like to just take this time to congratulate UNESCO for the quality of that work. Really, this report really does show us that around the world, something like 40% of cases, young girls have have access to primary education, and the results are even lower for secondary education. In other words, imagine the children who are who have disabilities, they're not even represented in that. The second aspect was, if we look at the global statistics, we can see that even before COVID, there was something like a billion children who ought to be in schools, but very often it's the women, rural, young girls that are excluded from education. And when you take all of those different factors, and you realize that inclusion in education is a very complex issue, and when we talk about inclusive education, it really means reaching out to those disadvantaged groups and how to make sure that in every single country, planning and policy planning is performed in such a way as to bring on board those who are being left behind. Now, we've heard about early childhood education from some of the previous speakers, and that's important. But remember, we've got to get them, we've got to support these people right all the way up to the end of university studies and into the professional integration. This all starts with literacy, because if you've got illiteracy in a country where the parents are illiterate, then you will never find that these people send their kids to school. And the same goes for children who have a handicap that would prevent them from attending school. And this is where we need to have a very thorough, holistic approach to inclusive education. The second major challenge, and this is an area where we really need to expend more efforts, is when looking at specific disabilities. For example, if we look at the context of COVID, or when you tell people to maintain social distance, to wash your hands, to wear a mask, imagine if they can't afford the masks, they don't have clean water. And so when you look about including disabled children, you really, first of all, you've got to cover the basic health issues. Here again, this needs to be streamlined into any policy planning. Another aspect is the rural dimension. If they live a long way from school, if we want to ensure that all children, including disabled children, make it to school, it's important to find ways to make this possible. And this is particularly true in the rural sector, but it's also true in the urban setting, where there are parents who still hide their disabled children. And so here again, it's important to make sure that awareness raising and communication efforts be made in order to ensure that in every single country, in an exhaustive way, all children are reached, regardless of their situation, of their handicap, and to make sure that all of this starts at the local level, the regional level, and finally at the domestic level, the whole national level, and make sure that there are sufficient spaces internationally in houses like UNESCO to ensure that this makes the mainstream. Another important consideration, I feel, is the involvement of families. Yes, and this depends on your communication strategy, but also it requires the teacher buy-in, because you have to ensure that everybody is sharing the same vision of what inclusive education means. Education is often decentralized. And so we've got to make sure that at the local level, all of the decisions are made in the appropriate manner, but also that these are funded. And here again, very often, unfortunately, funding for education is dropping for many regions around the world. And here again, I think more needs to be done. It's important for countries to keep focusing on maintaining funding levels for education, because that's the only way that we're going to help special needs children in education.
Another dimension, which for me is really essential, is how can we make sure that we give teachers the capacity to act? That's something that we see in many nations. Often when it comes to teacher training, it is a fundamental link in the chain. It's not something that can be neglected. We need to be able to train teachers, but also education inspectors and also school boards of administration, as well as those in charge of planning, educational planning, and ministers for education and for finance, who are ultimately the ones who are going to unblock the funds to make sure that inclusive education exists. But also at an institutional level, I believe that it's very important that in countries where there are not the right laws in place, these laws need to be implemented so that we can have, in these countries, inclusive education. Also, very sincerely, I would like to say that if we want to build a society based on peace, but also a society that is resilient and that is forward-looking, we need to make sure that we can give a space to children, adolescents who have disabilities, because we're not just speaking about children, but in fact others around these children are also affected by these issues. So we have to make sure that we have the means to act. In Burkina, we have succeeded in this because we have worked with the civil society that is developing innovative and pertinent actions. at the grassroots level, and they are accompanying, supporting those concerned. Also, we have focused on the health sector, the agricultural sector, the family support. It's a holistic vision that we have, really working from the bottom up, making decisions, making sure that the organization is in place, but also listening to all of the stakeholders. And I believe that if we can act in this way, we are going to be able to build societies that are much more resilient, and we will have more humane societies where we have values of peaceful coexistence, but also fairness, where every individual can find their place in the world. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, vraiment, entre les points que vous avez soulignés, l'importance de l'implication de toute la chaîne des acteurs.
Thank you very much, and thank you. I can see how you put a lot of emphasis on.
Well, yes, and of course, you spoke about, a lot about the involvement of all of those along in the chain, all stakeholders, and we need to make sure that inclusive education is a right for all. This is a right that, of course, UNESCO, the World Bank, and UNICEF, and the WHO have really put forward as a main priority. And indeed, this should inspire governments when it comes to them addressing these issues. Please stay with us, because we will come back to you at the end.
Another key person today with us, the Secretary of State of Portugal for Education, Mr. João Costa, who is the key person in one of the champion countries for inclusive education when it's about implementation of the inclusive education policies. And as the special rapporteur, Madame Bouli-Barry has already mentioned, mise en œuvre, implementation is the key important stage where sometimes obstacles come and somehow didn't allow countries to make a progress. So my question is, what did you achieve in your country? Which are the obstacles still, but also how during the pandemic especially you could provide inclusive education through, I suppose, distance learning and other tools to children with disabilities and special needs. Thank you for 7 minutes or a bit, if it's possible, more concise.
Sure. Good morning or good evening, everyone. Thank you, Stefania, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be moderated by you. And also I would like to thank UNESCO for making Portugal co-host of this event, because it's a great pleasure for us. Not because of any status of champions, but as learners about inclusion. I'd like also to greet the other panel members, and a special word to Mr. Eddie Ndopu for setting the tone for our conversation. And before I jump into your questions, I'd also like to give a special word to all the humans, since we are celebrating today the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And this is also a strong matter of inclusion. So it's a bit tough to separate what we accomplished and what are the challenges, because whenever we face a challenge, it's based on the obstacles to reach them. But so this is a long story, starting in the 90s with a full appropriation of the Salamanca Declaration, with a big effort and continuous effort, both in policies and in investment on this area. And because we were, when our government, actually the previous government in which we participated, took office, we were at a very good stage. We had, as was mentioned, 97.5% 95% of the children with some kind of disability integrated in the system. And that set the ground for us to be able to accelerate this process and give the next step. And the next step, which is the most ambitious one, the most difficult one, is to move from a system that integrates children and young students with any kind of disability to take this step from integration to inclusion. What we have achieved is very difficult, it's very ambitious. And what we have achieved so far, and this is, it appears details, but it's not, we have invested a lot on the appropriation of the content of this word, inclusion. What does it mean? When we say all means all, we are not taking the focus out of very specific difficulties, namely those that have to do with physical or cognitive difficulties or impairments. We are talking about looking around and seeing who are the excluded ones. And these may have underlying causes due to the language they speak, the socioeconomic background, some transient stage of stress or difficult to be well. They are victims of bullying in school. And so when we say all means all, it means that we do not include, but it's okay for some, but then if it's about suffering about sexual orientation or homophobia, then that's not our role, because it's a different matter. We also made a big effort into making everyone aware that inclusion also means differentiation in the class and individualized responses. Not individualized because we take the students out of class to put them somewhere else, but individualized responses because we are taking every individual into account in the classroom. We also moved from a model that was very much clinical and based on labeling and categorization. We then standardized responses. So if you have autism or if you have dyslexia, these are the measures for you. So we don't need labels. Yes, there can be some clinical diagnosis, but we look at the student as a whole. Because sometimes when we label, we overlook other aspects of exclusion. We created in the schools multidisciplinary teams. This is an important step, because it could be very easily the case that the diversity was for the special needs educator. But what we are promoting is a whole school approach in which everyone is responsible for those who have difficulties in accessing the curriculum. So if I, as a teacher of mathematics, have a student with difficulties, I'm the first one responsible. And I can use all the resources in my school and all my colleagues and the knowledge and the wisdom of some of my colleagues to help me attend this student. Another change in the law was to make sure that all students have a certificate by the end of their schooling. We, Stefania and I, surely did completely different different than the one in Portugal, but we are still two persons who completed a 9th grade in school when we were a bit younger than we are now. So this certification is important, and also the importance of the growth of all students. So sometimes we think of the excluded and we ignore that the non-excluded grow better and more and healthier if they are together with the others. For this to happen, it was important to develop a consistent and coherent curriculum policy. So we defined a student profile with the areas of competence that all students should develop. And there are principles and values in this student profile, and inclusion is one of them. But we are talking about things like problem solving, critical thinking, but also autonomy in interpersonal relationship for everyone, for all students. We also did a difficult curriculum review to do a bit of curriculum downsizing, because many times we heard, yes, I want to promote success to all my students, but the contents are too many, so I have to accelerate. And this is the best way to leave some behind. It's because they can keep the pace, but the teacher still feels pressured to do the whole thing, and then there's no time or opportunity to attend to specific needs. Another part of this Lego that we are building has to do with the citizenship strategy that we defined, and we reintroduced citizenship and development. And the word development has two meanings: personal development, but also the sustainable development, including domains that have to be addressed in every schools, like human rights, interculturality, diversity. It's interesting that this citizenship strategy causes many tensions in some areas of our society, because people will say this is not a matter for school, this is a matter of opinion, this is ideology, but inclusion is ideology, is an ideological statement. So let's not be afraid of the words and assume them. Our minister already mentioned in the opening session the crucial aspect of student voice. We cannot include without giving the voice to the students who are excluded. We many times hear and talk about those students who do not want to be in school, but we many times fail in asking them why they are not, do they not want to be in school. And just to mention another piece, so our law on the curriculum now has a special article stating that schools should or must create regular instances to give the students a voice. Very last aspect of this action, this coherent action, and I'd really like to single out this. There's more, but we are working and implementing a national plan for the arts, and continuing investment on physical education and sports. Why I mention this here is that many times in many of our countries, students are considered unable to follow the curriculum, but they attend the arts and physical education classes. And this has to be interpreted. This means that those areas know how to include. And so we, coming from Portuguese geography, mathematics, should look at what is done in these subjects and learn from them. And also, these are areas of well-being. We have arts and aesthetic and cultural fruition because it makes us feel well. And inclusion is about membership, it's about being part, it's about feeling well where I am. Now, about obstacles and the pandemic, we were very much aware of the difficulty of this legislation. This has to do with different practices, with different appropriation, with sometimes conflicts between what is the parental view, what is the teacher's view, some bias that exists. So we created a national coordination team with regional teams to do a close follow-up with the schools. We also, when the law was published, a couple of days later, we published a practice handbook with suggestions, not prescriptive, but with suggestions to implement this law. We identify assessment as one crucial problem, and so we are also holding a national project for assessment, and even more difficult in the relation between external assessment, exams, and inclusions. Now we are currently working on a plan that was approved in the state budget for reinforcement of inclusion on two axes: resources, human resources, and capacity building. And one obstacle that we really want to address in the next stages is how to encompass the role of each subject, how to include in each specific subject, as I mentioned before.
We have. I have a tough role today. I'm very sorry, but we have to. We are a bit afraid.
Yeah, I was not keeping track of time. I'm so sorry. So I'll go straight to the pandemic and close there. Let's not pretend the pandemic was an eye-opener for the issues of inclusion. So that's something that we cannot lose after the pandemic. But those who were already more vulnerable were the most vulnerable ones during the pandemic. We tried everything we could, partnerships with municipalities, with firms to provide equipment, home support, created a TV channel with this background of inclusion as well in the classes that were delivered through television. We created a support site to develop orientation, sharing good practices, and focus a lot on the preparation of this year with priorities and financial priorities for the most vulnerable, with a focus on social and emotional skills, inviting the schools to present plans for social, community, and communitary development. And we are also preparing a national diagnosis of the impact of the school lockout. I will now post some links to some of these things in the chat box for sharing. They are in Portuguese, but since, as UNESCO knowledge, this is the sixth most spoken language in the world, I'm sure many people will be able to read and have access to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, João. Thank you very much, Secretary of State of Portugal. Language diversity is one of our assets as well. So happy to have the link in Portuguese in our chat. And a lot of inspiring points. I pick up one distinguishing the distinction between inclusion and integration and inclusion, and understanding inclusion as providing differentiated and individualized responses to children with disabilities, and definitely to children as well. Thank you very much. I'm moving now to the last speaker today, Mr. Jaya Prasada Acharya from Nepal, a country where the government introduced strong reforms to strengthen the rights of people with disabilities and to expand educational opportunity. Jaya is currently responsible for overseeing the development of an inclusion education master plan. And we are very, very excited and happy to hear from him directly, which are the achievements and which are still maybe some challenges to share with us. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefania. First of all, thank you for UNESCO team. Stefania herself played role of a moderator. So I think UNESCO is giving more emphasis on inclusive education. Honorable Minister and Stefania and the UNESCO colleagues and all the distinguished participants and panelists. The time is very limited. I will be within my given time. Let's start from the given guidelines. Nepal has made progress on providing access to and participation in education for the children, as well as achieving gender equity in basic and secondary education. It means less than 3% children are still out of school. We have already achieved gender parity index in school education up to secondary level. So these are the achievements. Regarding the inclusive education, there are about 33 special schools and about 380 integrated schools and more than 100 so-called inclusive schools. We have to assist many more things to develop real inclusive schools. And there are about 62 assessment centers, assessment as well as referral centers. These are some of the figures. Regarding the inclusive education master plans, our government has set 6 objectives. The first objective is structure of the special needs education system at the federal, provincial, and local level. This is the first objective. The second objective is to develop system of evidence-based special needs education or inclusive education planning and programming. The third one is to develop and strengthen the inclusive education human resource capacity, including policymakers, teachers, professionals, planners, managers, and members of inclusive education committees, different committees, to develop need-based curriculum and textbook, teaching learning materials, and the instructional technologies. And the fifth one is to establish integrated system of services and facilities of inclusive education through interagency coordination. The last objective is to ensure necessary financial resources for the inclusive education within the overall education budgetary system. So there are some major components. I will not go through the whole component. I will just share the glimpse. The first one is legal infrastructure development. So our constitution is quite new constitution. That's why for the last couple of years, our nations involved in the preparation of legal infrastructure. Related with the inclusive education, policy provisions, we claim that our constitution is inclusive one, the latest one and inclusive one. So based on the constitutions, the Compulsory and Free Education Act has been, approved. So this is one of the steps for the legal infrastructure. And beside that, we are implementing a school sector development plan. There are so many, initiatives in that plan. And we have also a special needs education policy. And last year, we have developed comprehensive national education policy, and inclusive education policy is one of the components of that federal level comprehensive national education policy. So there are many more provisions over there, and child-friendly school national framework is also there. Let's think about the implementation arrangement. So far we have developed based on this legal provision as well as master plan. Ministry of Education, Science and Technology at the federal level, and a Special Education Council is over there, chaired by the Honorable Minister. Inclusive education units are at the federal level within the federal level units. So each of the technical departments, there are inclusive education sections. So they are structured. Then at the provincial level, Social Development Ministry is there. Provincial government is new for us in Nepal. So Social Development Ministry is working over there. Then provincial education training centers are there. There are 7 big training centers, and training centers are responsible for the training capacity development related activities. And besides that, there are provincial education directorate offices. These are responsible for province level management and monitoring all these things. The last not least, according to our constitution, local government is fully responsible for school level education. So there are many more provisions under the local level government, and some of the local government have already prepared act, regulation, policies. Some are under preparation. Let's think from the support system. So far we have achieved. It might be relevant to other colleagues as well. Expanding access to quality education for children with a disability. It means if we see our EMIS system, we find that about 2% children. It means among all the children, about 2% children are with any kind of disabilities. So nowadays, each and every year, the children are being enrolled in schools, and we are trying to provide education access to children. And based on the master plan, what we have provision is that more than 90% NGOs are within the Kathmandu Valley. So teachers are requesting us for the support, and trainer are now available at the countryside. Why not to establish well-equipped training center at all the provinces? That's why from the last year, government has allocated resources to each of the provinces to establish a model type of training centers and support centers. So this is one of the initiation. Besides that, federal level government has provided fund to the local level as well, selected local levels, to develop special schools, especially focusing on higher secondary level education. These are some of the initiations. Scholarship, free textbook distribution, and other type of facilities are also there. Teacher training, disability friendly environment development. It means after devastating earthquake, Nepal government has constructed many more buildings. All the buildings are disabled friendly. It is also one of the achievement. Then distribution of learning materials, and then equity strategy in South Asia. Last time, Stefania was also there, I think, in one of the conferences. Nepal has developed, concentrated equity strategy. It is clearly linked, directly linked with the planning and financing, targeting in the certain areas. So it is one of the intervention government of Nepal has created. Then recently, in 3 universities for the higher education, we have started to create university level support center for the children with disability, especially for the higher education. These are some of the initiations. Let's focus on challenges, insufficient attitude and behavior, not only Nepal, maybe all the world. This is one of the problem. Multiple exclusion, cultural capital, all these things are also challenged even in Nepal. Economic, social, and regional handship is also there. Insufficient in linking of rights with the resources. It is still problem. Mapping out services and uneven distribution is also one of the problem. Insufficient database and information. It means for the last 2 years, we have enhanced the capacity of EMIS, colleagues, and strengthened the EMIS. Now we have some of the data of disability, but not sufficient. So had to be strengthened the EMIS system. Then sufficient pedagogy and preparedness, and sustaining gains and targeted intervention.
Thank you very
much.
This
is also the problem. Okay.
I kindly ask you to conclude, really, because we are absolutely exceeded the time limits we had. So please.
Okay, then I will focus. I will conclude my presentation within 1 minute. Let's focus on future directions. Proper documentation and database. It is one of the focus area for future direction. Research and innovation, especially focusing on inclusive education and disability. IT application for the empowerment and pedagogies. Entitlement for basis, teachers, textbook, technologies, all these things. Equipment allocation of the resources. Then community and parental engagement. Enhancing learning and raising self-esteem. Creating inclusive and enabling environment at home and educational institutions. Networking, coordination and collaboration. Inclusion and attaining equity and learning. These are the future prospect in our from our Nepalese government. Thank you for providing an opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jaya, for this comprehensive presentation. Yeah, it's a bit late to go for a second and last round, but I'm sure that you heard, as I did, a lot of keywords that can also represent the statements from our 4 outstanding panelists. I once again thank all of them, and I thank all of you for attending with us this interesting first opening session of this interesting conference. I wish a fruitful conversation today and the coming days about inclusion and the importance of keeping this topic at the very core top of the agenda in the coming months and years. Thank you very much, and bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Stefania, and especially for moderating this high-level panel discussion. May I also thank and join her to thank our 4 panel speakers for their wonderful contributions. Allow me to also express our gratitude once again to His Excellency, Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Manas Antoninis, and Mr. Eddie Nuvdopu for joining us for the opening session amidst their busy schedule. This brings us to the end of the opening session of the 3-day International Symposium. Already in this hour and a half, we are inspired by the strong commitment and innovative experiences shared by our distinguished speakers, but also we were reminded that there are still many challenges, obstacles, and issues, and that the work to realize a genuinely inclusive society and education of quality for all is far from over. So we would therefore like to continue to share, exchange, and learn from one another's experiences, research, and data from across countries, communities, partners, in the subsequent sessions of the symposium. So I would like to welcome and encourage all of you to join us again later today at 3 p.m. Paris time for session 1. Please do connect to this same Zoom link, which will also be put up in the chat space again. Please also register for session 1 in case you have not done so yet. So thank you very much once again, and see you at 3 p.m. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.